So it has been approximately a week since I started reconstituting all of my sourdough. I actually had to add the rest of my sourdough starter to my batch because it wasn't getting as bubbly as it should have been. And so I have been constantly feeding this twice a day. I feed it at night and I feed it in the morning just for the best results. I want to keep that sourdough nice and fluffy. This guy is actually super full right now. So you can see how it's really stringy. I'm actually gonna go ahead and discard a whole bunch of this and leave just a little bit and then feed it again with water and flour. And then we're gonna go ahead and get our flour auto-leasing. So basically this is just allowing the flour gluten to go ahead and really absorb the water. We're not going to be adding our sourdough starter just yet. One of my favorite tools that I've been using is actually a couple different schedules that Pro Home Cooks put on one of their videos, and I'll go ahead and link that down below. But they have all of these great schedules. I think there's about 5 of them. I'm actually going to be following the One Day Baker timesheet schedule. So this right here is actually the formula for making a good sourdough bread. So this is the baker's hydration percentage. So basically your entire loaf of sourdough is going to be based solely on the amount of flour you're using. So for these loaves I'm going to be making, I'm going to base it on the 800 grams of flour that I'll be using, and then you'll take that 800 and multiply it by your 80% of hydration. I recommend for a beginner loaf to do a 70 to 75% hydration, just because it's not going to be as sticky. With the 80% hydration, it's going to be so sticky. My first couple loaves I did around the 70 to 75% hydration loaf, just because it is a little easier to work with, and as you learn and develop your skills, you'll be able to go ahead and up the water percentage, getting it to that 80% that most bakers do use. So let's go ahead and find out how much of our water we will need at an 80% hydration if we're using those 80 grams of flour. So if we're going to go ahead and find that 80% hydration for the 800 grams, we're simply going to take 800 and multiply it by 80%. When put into a decimal, it's just going to be 0.8. So you're just basically moving this decimal point 2 spaces to get what it would be. And then, so it's going to be 640 grams of water. We'll go ahead and do the math for the sourdough starter percentage, which is 15, and then 2% salt. If you want your loaf to be a little saltier, you can add a little bit more salt, or if you don't want it as salty, you can of course reduce that a little bit. So again, we're just going to take that off of the amount of flour that we have, so it's the 800 grams, and then you're going to multiply that, moving the decimal point 2 spaces, 0.15. So it's going to be 120 grams of our sourdough starter that we'll need for this. And then again, we'll do the 2% for the salt. So again, we're taking the grams of flour that we have and multiplying it by the 0.02 for the 2% of salt. So we'll need 16 grams of salt. So I'm just gonna go ahead and actually discard a majority of this. I'm going to leave about 2 to 4 tablespoons of starter, or about 50 grams of starter. I found that that's like the perfect amount. You can make discard pancakes. You just literally plop this in a cast iron skillet with some oil and a little bit of salt, and slow and steady cook it on the cast iron. It's delicious. But I'm just going to go ahead and toss this. You can also put it in your compost, or make crackers. Like, there's a whole variety of things that you can go ahead and do this, so you're not just throwing it in the garbage. So here we have what's left after I've discarded. It's just some scrapings at the bottom. So I actually have made note of how much my container weighs. It's about 20 grams. So I have about 65 grams of starter in this. So I'm gonna go ahead and add 65 grams of flour, 65 grams of ice cold water, just because I wanna go ahead and slow down this activation process for this starter, and then we'll get started on auto-leasing. This little rubber band's just gonna go ahead and tell me how much starter I started with. That way I know when it has doubled. When it has doubled, it's going to be at the peak time for it to be used. We can also go ahead and do a float test, and I'll explain that a little later once it is time to actually use the starter. But for now, I'm just gonna gently press my lid on. I'm not gonna go ahead and seal it, because if you do seal your sourdough, it's likely that it will explode, just because there is so much gas being released by the yeast in this that it will expand. So I don't recommend closing your containers. Just loosely setting the lid on is perfect. So I actually go ahead and set my sourdough starter by this wax warmer. I found that this is the perfect spot for this to get perfect amount of warmth that it needs to actually go ahead and rise. I might actually just set it a little further away, just because I wanted to actually have a little more time to go ahead and do its thing. But setting it by a warm source or putting it in your oven where there's a light on, these are all great options to get your sourdough to rise like you want it to. So we're gonna go ahead and get started on our auto leasing of our flour and water. I'm gonna get my big bowl, and we're gonna go ahead and tear out the weight of the bowl, because we don't want to include that in our weights. I'm gonna go ahead and do a mixture of unbleached all-purpose flour, unbleached bread flour, and whole wheat flour. I feel like these combined just kind of give it an overall better flavor, and it's a little more diverse than just using a bread flour, but you absolutely can just use one type of flour and it won't hurt your bread at all. So I'm going to start with my unbleached flour, or unbleached all-purpose flour, and I need 800 grams of flour in total. So I'm just going to go ahead and finish off this bag. Gives us about 210. I'm going to do about 1/3 of the whole wheat flour and 2/3 of the bread and all-purpose flour. All right, 803. So I'm just going to go ahead and gently mix these flours together, just because I want them to be nice and well incorporated. And the best process with making dough or sourdough is to use your hands. It gives you a better feel of where your bread is at and what consistency it has. So with sourdough, at the very end of the process, your dough should be nice and smooth. So I really do recommend using your hands, but you can absolutely use like a wooden spoon. So now we need to go ahead and add in our 80% of water, which would be that 640 grams. So I'm gonna go ahead and tear this out. And again, I'm gonna use ice cold water so that this is a nice slow process. So the main goal of auto leasing is to hydrate all of the gluten that is in your bread. We don't want any dry bits while it's in this process, simply because then it's easier for the sourdough starter to take hold of the carbohydrates that are in the flour. So I went a little over. I'm just gonna go ahead and like spoon some of this out. Alright, so I'm just gonna go ahead and get my hands in here now that we've got this all in the bowl. It's going to be very wet, and we're not really trying to beat this, but just kind of get all the flour wet. So like pinching and just kind of scooping the side of the bowl. It's a really messy process, and this bread is not going to look pretty at this stage. It is going to be messy, it's going to be shaggy, it's not going to have that nice smooth finish that you'll see once we get to our proofing step. So all of these dry bits need to get incorporated. This is as good as we want it. We don't need to go full ham and blend this up in a KitchenAid mixer or use a handheld mixer. It just needs to be a shaggy mess. As you can see, we're gonna go ahead and put a tea towel over this, and we're just gonna let it rest. When we come back in the morning, this is going to be a little bit different, but not much. We're not gonna see any rise or leaven in it just because we haven't added our yeast yet, but I will see you guys in the morning. So as you guys can see, our dough has fully hydrated. It is about 7 a.m. the next morning. One tip I would give is to make sure that your tea towel is wet or damp so that your dough does not dry out. Our starter has fully grown. So this is where we started, and we've more than doubled it. So we're gonna go ahead and do a float test on this guy just to see at what stage of activation he is at. The float test is basically taking a scoop of sourdough starter and just plopping it into some water. And if your sourdough is floating on the top like this, it is perfectly ripe and ready to be put into your dough. If it sinks to the bottom, then it is not ready. So for this step of adding in our sourdough starter and our salt, I have a little bit of water in here. I probably should have left this out when I was doing the autolyse stage, but I have just a little bit in this just to make it so that the salt can dissolve and be more easily incorporated. I recommend that when you're doing this at home that you leave like 20 grams of your water out during the autolysing stage to add your salt into, so that when you add your salt into your dough, it gets more mixed in. So I'm actually gonna go ahead and add in the salt first so that we can get it to dissolve in this little bit of water that I have here. So turn on the scale. We need about 16 grams of salt. I tend to like my dough to be a little saltier than this hydration percentage. So I typically add about a couple grams more than what it says. This is just regular sea salt. You can use any kind of salt for your dough, whatever you have on hand. I do recommend salts that are not iodized. And I'm just gonna go ahead and try to incorporate this into the water. Not all of it is going to dissolve, just because there's not enough water in here for it to dissolve, but the majority of it would be okay. Alright, so I'm gonna go ahead and tear this out, and then we need to go ahead and add in 120 grams of the starter. 121 is perfect. It leaves us with a good amount left over. I might even still take some of this out, just because when maintaining sourdough, the less starter you have, the easier it is to maintain, because the less water and flour you have to use to rehydrate it and feed it. I'm just gonna go ahead and kind of stir this in a little bit. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and start incorporating our starter into our dough. So by doing this, we're just gonna go ahead and plop this guy over the top. Make sure we get the majority of the salt out. This is also why I kind of like adding excess salt when I add it to the water. And what we're gonna go ahead and do is just kind of evenly distribute our starter over the top and dimple it in. And then we're just gonna do some basic folds on this guy. So I'm gonna take the edge and fold him in. We're not really trying to mix this per se. We're just trying to get that starter in there without, you know, using a blender or what have you. So I did about another 30 seconds to about a minute of these basic folds, just really trying to get that starter mixed in. I'm gonna do some slight pinching. So while I'm mixing this, I am kind of showing you guys a variety of methods of mixing in the sourdough, from the folding over to the pinching, and then this last method that I'm going to be coming up on is called the row bond method. I got this from Joshua Wisman's Unapologetic Cookbook. It's basically where your hand is cupped, you pull it underneath the dough, and you're supposed to bring it up to let it stretch, and then you slap it back down. It makes a really absurd sound, but it really helps to go ahead and develop that gluten in the bread. All right, so right now it is a super gloopy, slimy, sticky mess. We're gonna let this go ahead and rest for about 30 minutes, and then we're gonna go ahead and start on our stretch and fold. It's done about every 30 minutes and for about 2 to 2.5 hours. So I'm gonna go ahead and put a wet tea towel on top of this so that this does not dry out. Last night I put a dry one, which was fine. I fixed it, but a wet tea towel is gonna work the best to keep your dough nice and moist. Either that or a nice saran wrap. I do not own saran wrap, so a wet tea towel is what I'm gonna use. Alright, so I went ahead and I turned on my oven to 350 just to warm up my kitchen, just because it is a little cool in here. And the best temperature for, or room temperature for making bread is about 72 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, I'm on my second stretch and fold. So again, I'm just gonna stretch it to the side, not letting it break, because we wanna go ahead and build that nice, fluffy, aerated interior of this bread. You can already see it has some air bubbles forming. We're not going to go ahead and try not to pop those as best as we can. It's already forming such a beautiful loaf. It's getting really fluffy and jiggly, which is awesome. I'm going to go ahead and do this side over here. And then we'll do one more on this corner. Alright, and we're just going to top this with the damp towel and move on to another 30 minutes. Alright guys, so this is the last fold and stretch. As you can see, our dough is getting quite fluffy. So I'm just going to go ahead and do the final fold and stretch, taking each corner, stretching it as far as it can go without breaking any of the dough bonds, and then just gently folding it on top of itself. With each stretch, I turn the bowl about 90 degrees and do another stretch. So as you can see, there are tons of bubbles in this. We did a really good job at capturing all of that air in this dough. I'm gonna go ahead and put my towel back over it. So I'm actually gonna place this dough with the towel over it in my oven, just because it's gonna be warmer in there and it's gonna speed up the proofing process. I have my oven light on, that way it does keep it a little bit warmer. And this should take about 5 or so hours for the bread to fully proof. And I'll go ahead and show you a proofing test once we get to the end of that time. Sourdough is a really beautiful technique, and it is something that takes time, which is typically why I like to save these kinds of projects for weekends, just because I'm not working. But it's such a beautiful like slowdown from our everyday fast-paced lives that it really just makes you appreciate the slow nature of actually building this bread and making a beautiful, delicious, moist interior with a little bit of chew and that nice crunchy exterior of this bread. Alright friends, it is now about 3:30 in the afternoon. We have just finished our bulk rise, and this is where we want our bread to go ahead and double or even like 30 to 50% increase in size. So our bread has definitely done that. It is large and in charge, and it has so many bubbles, and it's beautiful. So we're gonna go ahead and get our surface floured. I already went ahead and I cleaned my countertops really well, just to make sure that we're not putting any weird stuff into our dough. I'm just gonna go ahead and flour my surface with the all-purpose flour. And it doesn't need to be caked on, just gently dusted is great. We just don't want our dough to stick to the surface. So we are going to go ahead and gently scoop this out of the bowl and put it on the surface. Trying not to break down any of those beautiful bubbles that we created with our pre-shaping. Alright, there is the blob. So we're gonna go ahead and just do a quick pre-shape. I'm going to be doing 2 loaves. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut this in half real fast with a bench scraper. So I'm gonna use my flour just to draw a kind of guide to follow. And then I'm actually going to go ahead and wet my bench scraper here, non-sticking as possible. All right, so now we've got two separate guys. I'm gonna go ahead and flour over here. And for this guy, I'm just gonna go ahead and roll him. And you're kind of tucking and rolling at the same time just to get this nice ball. And then I'm gonna go ahead and plop him over here. All right, so again, I'm gonna go ahead and do this one a little different. I'm gonna fold him. And this last guy, we're gonna go ahead and all the way over. Just kind of tuck him. And then in one movement, I'm gonna go ahead and try to flip this guy over. So this one's gonna go in my round banneton, and this one's gonna go in my more oval banneton. So this is just our pre-shaping phase. I'm gonna go ahead and get my tea towel a little more damp, and then I'm just gonna rest it on top of these guys while they are finishing their bench resting time, which is gonna be about 30 minutes. And then we'll go ahead and do our final shaping. We're gonna place them into our bannetons and then go ahead and proof them. All right, so here I have my two bannetons. This guy might be a little too big for this. But we'll see how it goes. I'm going to go ahead and flour these really well, just so that when we do go to pull these guys out of these, they hopefully will not stick too badly. Alright, we're going to go ahead and do our pre-shape of these before we toss them into these bannetons. For this guy, I am going to go ahead and just roll. And then roll again. Then I'm going to flip him on his back and do some cross. And then this guy, both of these I'm going to go ahead and put the seam side, so the side that is on the bottom right now is going to be facing up. Because when we go ahead and take these to put into our Dutch oven, we're going to be flipping them upside down, so we want that seam to be on the bottom of our loaves of bread. So I'm just going to go ahead and kind of gently get him ready to be plopped. And then pop him in there. And I'm just going to go ahead and pinch the seams. Alright, so this guy is perfect. And we're going to go ahead and get started on this guy here. So again, I'm just going to kind of roll him onto himself. Reflour everything. Gingerly roll him. See how beautiful and fluffy he is. I'm gonna do a very light dusting on him. I should have done this on the first guy just to prevent all that stickage. But you will see, get all the way around on top, all the sides. Be careful not to pop any of the bubbles that we created. Alright. So just like we did with this guy, we're going to go ahead and just very easily make sure he is nice and unstuck on the bottom. I'm going to put some flour on this. So again, we're just going to go ahead and plop this nice side upside down so that the seam of this bread is facing upwards. So I've kind of worked around the edges, and now I'm going to go ahead and try your hardest not to be too rough with the bread. It can be hard though. So you can go ahead and cover your bread as it's sitting and resting and doing its final proofing stage with pretty much anything. I'm going to go ahead and dust this one just a little bit just so he's not tempted to stick to anything. So I'm going to go ahead and cover these just with my tea towel here, and we're going to let these rest again for another 30 minutes while they continue to proof, and then we'll go ahead and do a proof test. Alright friends, so it has been about an hour and a half to 2 hours for this final proofing. We are going to go ahead and do a poke test. This is basically where you poke the dough gently to see how much of it bounces back. If it bounces back and doesn't hold the shape too much, then it's perfectly ready to go. If the dough keeps the indent and it doesn't bubble back up, then that means that you need to go ahead and proof your bread and let it sit for just a while longer, about an hour, maybe more. The temperature in your kitchen or wherever you're baking your bread is going to change how long it's going to take for this bread to proof. My kitchen is about at 70 degrees. Optimal temperature for bread proofing is about 72 degrees Fahrenheit. So we'll just go ahead and give this a poke. And as you can see, it does kind of still have a bit of an indent, but it really bounced back quite well. So let's try this one over here. And again, that one bounced back way better than this one did, but this one is also ready. I'm gonna go ahead, since this one bounced back better, I'm gonna put this one in my oven first, and then this one will have a bit more time to go ahead and proof. There's some really lovely bubbles here, which I love to see. I love seeing nice developed bubbles, because it's going to be a nice aerated bread. So we need to go ahead and get our oven preheated. Our oven should be preheated at about 500 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm going to go ahead and stick my Dutch oven in there as well so it is nice and warm too. And then once those are nice and hot, then we'll add in that first banneton of fresh bread. And I'm so excited to have some fresh bread. I made up some soup with some acorn squashes that I had grown, and I think that the bread and the soup is just going to pair together so nicely. Alright friends, the Dutch oven and oven are preheated. I'm going to go ahead and do this loaf first because it looked like it was proofed more to completion than the round one. So basically we're going to be super ginger and just kind of flip him in here. I'm going to put a little bit of flour on the top of this so it's not super sticky. Kind of rub it in, again being kind of easy just because there are a ton of bubbles on this and I don't really want to pop them, but we also don't want giant piles of flour on the bottom of our dough. So we're gonna take this super easy and try to just kind of ease our dough. This is kind of what I was afraid of. There's some stickage. This is the one that I forgot to go ahead and flour before I put on. And this is why you want to make sure that everything is nice and floured, otherwise it will stick. Alright, so I had to do some magic. I kind of had to reshape this a bit, which is not typically what you're supposed to do, so we'll see how this loaf turns out. I blame this on me forgetting to flour the top of this before laying it upside down in the banneton. It really did stick a whole bunch to the linen lining of this. I'm gonna go ahead and score this bread. I'm not going to do anything too fancy just because I'm afraid that it is going to go ahead and just kind of deflate because I had to reshape it again. But the best measure for scoring bread is you don't want to do it directly in the center. You want to do it off to the center on either direction, and you want your blade to be practically horizontal. You don't want it really at 45 unless you're going straight at the top. But again, you don't really want it to go straight at the top because your bread's going to expand out. If you put it off to the side, the bread is going to expand more upwards than outwards. So I'm just gonna do a really basic cut on the side, and then we're just gonna do a quick. Okay, this guy is going to go in the oven, and then he's going to cook for about 30 minutes. All right, so this bread is going to be in the oven at 500 degrees Fahrenheit for about 30 minutes with the Dutch oven lid on. After about 30 minutes, we're gonna go ahead and pop that lid off and keep it in the oven for about another 20 or so minutes. You really want the crust or crumb of your bread to be really dark and brown. That is all the natural sugars in your dough kind of caramelizing and giving that extra depth of flavor to your bread. So I'm gonna make sure to set a timer because I typically forget if I don't. And then I'll see you guys back when it comes out. I was so excited to see what this bread looked like that I forgot to turn my microphone on, but I'm turning my oven down about 50 degrees with the lid off for the remaining time. Alright guys, it's time to take this bread out of the oven, and it looks beautiful. It's got a super dark crust. I'm gonna go ahead and just lower this onto a drying rack I have on my counter. And I'm gonna go ahead and set my lid back on top of my Dutch oven just so it can heat up a little bit more. I'm gonna turn up the oven back up to 500 so we can get ready to put that second loaf in the oven. We're going to go ahead and gingerly plop it onto this parchment paper, and fingers crossed. Alright, so I haven't quite mastered taking bread out of bannetons yet. I'm gonna have to do some more research and to see exactly how to do that without messing up my bread. So again, a little bit of doctoring just to get this to fluff up like it is. I'm gonna go ahead and just plop it back onto my parchment paper, and hopefully we don't lose all of the glorious fluff. So the last thing to do is go ahead and score it. I'm going to go ahead and do a little something different. I'm going to grab a loose blade. So this is just a spare blade, and again, we want to keep this blade pretty much horizontal. And I'm going to go off from the center, and there's a really big air bubble right there, so I think I'm going to do this side. And I'm going to try to do a pretty design. I want to go about 1/2 inch deep. So I'm going to go kind of looks like a smiley face. I'm going to go ahead and plop this into our Dutch oven. It's at 500 degrees Fahrenheit with the lid on for about 30 minutes, and then we'll take the lid off, let it cook for another 10-15, and see where we're at. Alright guys, it is time to take off the lid on our second loaf and see how it's turning out. Ooh, she's pretty. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and put it back in for another 10 to 15 minutes. Alright friends, it has officially been a little over 12 hours of 12 hours of baking our sourdough bread. I just took out the last loaf from R2 and it looks phenomenal. I did forget to turn down the oven temperature from 500 to 450. I need to go ahead and transfer it to the cooling rack and then we'll go ahead and take a look at them. I don't know if you guys can hear this on the other end, but if you listen real closely, you can hear them crackling. So I think my sourdough baking for the day was perfect. There were a few times where I thought maybe it wasn't going to leaven as much as it should have, just because the dough was sticking in the banneton. Each time you're baking sourdough, you're going to go ahead and develop those skills. You're gonna know what to expect when it comes to the density and how many air bubbles it's gonna have and how fluffy it's gonna get and how to roll your hands underneath of the dough. These are all things that you're gonna pick up over time. Your first dough session, you may be a phenomenal baker and just not even know it, but there are those times or those people that may not be great bakers at first. It takes practice. Not everyone is born a baker. So I really highly encourage you guys to keep trying. This is about my 9th or 10th time baking sourdough, so I still don't have the expert skills that, you know, bakers have, obviously. I don't know that I'll ever get there, but it's such a delicious bread. You can make bagels, you can make crackers. There are so many possibilities with sourdough. Focaccia. I still need to try focaccia. But again, it's one of those tools that's nice to have in your tool belt and whip out when you need it or want it. So this is the first loaf of bread we did together. It is quite dark. That's typical of a sourdough. They have darkness, but the inside is going to be beautiful. And I'll go ahead and cut into this one because I am going to be eating this with dinner, and I'll show you what the crumb of the inside looks like.